Most of us, perhaps all of us, have wondered about and even wrestled with questions about life. For example, origins. Where did we come from? Or meaning. Does life have a purpose, or do we live a meaningless life and die? Another is morality. Why should we live any particular way at all? Is there an objective morality, or do we make it up as we go? Destiny is another one. What happens after we die? Do we cease to exist when we breathe our last, or do we continue existing in some form, and if so, do we go somewhere? There are many religions and belief systems. What are the areas of agreement and disagreement? Welcome to our merry band at the Fellowship of the Book, as we ponder the big question.
And the big question is Bill Honsberger in the house, and is he relatively sane? I don't know. He's here, I can see.
You're pushing on number 2. I'm in the middle of Omaha, Nebraska, with all these Husker people. It's a dangerous place. It's a really dangerous place. But we have a lot of dear friends out here. We were called as missionaries when I was a youth pastor in Nebraska. So
nice.
A whole lot of our support and encouragement has always come from the middle of nowhere in the United States, Nebraska.
Hey.
And my son dearly loves the Cornhuskers. So if I want to threaten him, I threaten to put a Colorado buffalo on his door. That's enough to get him truly fighting mad. But that's for another day. Okay, so we're talking about Islam. We're finishing up tonight. This is the fourth part of our series here on what Islam is. I gave you a short version of that, some of the important dates. Short version of some of their beliefs, the Hadith, the Qur'an, what they are, what the 5 pillars are, the 6th pillar, all sorts of other fun stuff like that. Tonight, I'm going to be giving some responses off the outline, but also just some ideas of, like, how is it that I've talked to them? I don't claim to have a magic wand for anybody I talk to, Satanists, which is Buddhists or Muslims or anybody else. But I do have some things that I've learned over the years that I try to apply. And just this last fall, I had several great rides with Uber drivers who are Muslims from Africa, and had great conversations. And every one of those guys about who Jesus really is, as opposed to Isa in the Quran. Who is Jesus really? And share the gospel with all 3 of these fellows. And there's some other conversations I've had over the years with different Muslims on all sorts of different things. Again, much like I don't argue with Mormons about holy underwear. I do not argue with JWs about Christmas trees. Even if I win, I've lost, because even if I win the fight, they're going to hell with a Christmas tree or something like this. It's just a stupid argument. So in the same way, I try to focus with more Muslims, in this case, on what's really important. I could care less about, some of the sillier Sharia laws and stuff like that. Yeah, I think I could have that discussion. I think I could take those arguments apart. But even if I win, I've lost. I have a Muslim now with a modified version of Sharia, and oh, by the way, still going to hell. So my focus is on, how do I get the gospel to these people? How do I get them to understand who Jesus really is? And so those are some of the kind of things I want to talk about. But first, I mentioned some of these before. We're going to offend them. You can count on it. And that's okay. As long as it's not your breath, you haven't taken a shower in a month. Boy, I was talking to some Hare Krishna fellows recently. Oh my gosh, they needed a shower so bad. Okay. Anyways, I don't want to argue the side issues, but I do want to focus on starting a conversation that's not going to end because I've already offended him. So I learned the hard way when I got my first copy of the Qur'an from the Saudi delegation at the Parliament of World Religions in '93. I had my foot across my leg. I crossed my legs because my knees are hurt. He couldn't give it to me. That went on for several minutes. I was with Eric Clement, and Eric got his, and the guy standing there awkwardly. Then I find out, oh, by the way, the Qur'an cannot be near your foot. I also had a class where I was teaching on Islam. That it was my world religions class, teaching for 3 weeks at a community college, and I had this copy, Bukhari's Hadith on top of the Qur'an on my desk. And I had a Muslim lady come up, oh, teacher, no. The Qur'an must be the top book. So again, not that they all necessarily have the exact same attitudes or superstitions or different things like this, but it's pretty standard. Most Muslims I've ever talked to, that the Qur'an, since it is literally Allah's word in the eternal, the heavenly book, the mother of all books, that it must be the highest. So if it's in your office, it must be the highest book in your office, and so on and so on. They would never stand on a Quran, like Southern fried preachers. I'm standing on the word of God. No, you're not going to see a Muslim do that ever. That'll get you killed in the wrong places. So they treat it with respect. That doesn't mean I have to treat it with respect. In my office, my Quran was on the lowest shelf possible. Okay, my own little message. But when my Muslim friend, apologist, came over, I always had it on my desk because I don't want to argue with a fellow about something that he's really upset about, and it stops the conversation right off the bat. I also want to find out very quickly what kind of Muslim they are. We illustrated a little bit of this. I'm not going to have an argument about some of the stranger things of Shia Islam with the Sunnah. They could care less. They view the Shia as non-Muslims. The kafir infidels are the worst. So there's no point bringing up some of the more bizarre things. On the other hand, I've had Shia bring up stuff about the Sunnah that are appropriate. And, like I said, there's an inter-house fight that's going on for only almost 1,400 years. That's worthy of death to have this discussion. But none of that points me to Jesus with them. So I try not to fight on these kind of things. I want to fight on what's absolutely important. So I mentioned some of these things here. And again, this is not a full-blown theology class, so I don't have a list of notes and verses and stuff like this. This I would recommend many websites to you for. But for example, Muslims deny the Trinity. How do they do that? Because they deny the deity of Christ. Jesus is, just as a reminder here, the second highest prophet of Islam. Isa is so respected. We're better Christians than you are because we would never say Jesus says he is God. So there's an argument that's been on the net for a while now where Muslims are out there arguing with Christians. Where does Jesus say, I am God, worship me, in those words? And there's several responses you'll find from David Wood and all sorts of other people on this. But this is really critical because the Quran denies the deity of Christ repeatedly. It denies the Trinity. Allah has no son over and over and over. That's really heavily emphasized. So it's very clear. Part of what's happening here is that the Muslim thinks what Christians believe, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, is that our conception of the Trinity is God the Father, Mary the Mother, those two had sex to produce Jesus the Son, which is what you see in Babylonian religion, Greek religion, Egyptian religion, so many other religions, and by the way, Mormon religion. No, it's not what we believe. But to their minds, it must be what we believe because Muhammad said so in the Quran itself. So whatever the Quran says is true regardless. Brings us up to another issue of tarif or corruption, which we'll get to later. So the Trinity is a lost cause with them. They don't care what the Bible says. Now, is it good to point out this is the word of God and this is what it says? Yes, I think so. And if you have enough time, it's good to do that. But it's kind of going right past them because it doesn't matter. The Bible's been corrupted. So I don't have to hear what you said. But Mohammed clearly said what the Trinity is. That's the truth. You Christians are all liars. You're all apostates and, all that kind of fun stuff. On the deity of Christ is really important. I had this long argument with my Muslim apologist friend, Wahid Khan from Pakistan. And this became a major issue with us. He really wanted to fight this out. And of course, according to him, and there's this idiot convicted felon guy claims to be the Mahdi, who's out there on the internet all over the place, claiming, I saw a video of his the other day, Paul, the Antichrist. Oh my gosh. Anyways, but his attitude reflects a lot of Muslims thinking that Paul is the one who corrupted the text. So tarif, the doctrine of corruption, Paul's the one who did it. Paul pulled it off. Paul's the evil one. All the other guys in the Bible are apostles and prophets, or they're prophets actually. But Paul's the bad guy, the worst guy of the story. So I wrote a 7-page letter to my friend Wahid, basically arguing for the deity of Christ without mentioning one of Paul's letters, no reference to it at all, but from the Gospels, from the Old Testament, stuff like this. And he looked at it for about 5 seconds and said, okay, well, I want to talk about this. Again, it didn't matter necessarily what I said because it's been corrupted. It's absolutely corrupted. So in some respects, one of the best ways to start this discussion is on why we should take seriously the claim that it's been corrupted. And I'm going to give you the version of this that I had with these Muslims in the Uber rides this last year. So I'm going to go all J. Vernon Wallace on for just a second here. The attitude that cops have about witnesses, the attitude that anybody should have about witnesses, why should I believe you? So if you remember, some of you are old enough, especially like Vino, never mind, some of people are old enough to remember the OJ trial and these claims from people around the country and some even from the world, from psychics and others who knew what happened. they had a vision of what happened. It was presented to them by their spirit guide or something. There was all these kind of claims. And so why should you take these things seriously? Well, the court obviously is not going to take them seriously. They believe a lot of stupid things, but not these ones. Who is a more likely, reliable witness? So if I say I'm on this podcast at this very moment with, with 5 different people on Windows and maybe other people listening, and I said, for example, that James Lopez, I've known James for a while. He's just retired from the NBA. Dude's about 6'10", monstrous rebounder. Played for the Bulls, won a championship with Michael J. Or Jordan. If I said that kind of thing, I can use the name, right? There's a lot of Michael Jordans out there.
Sure.
And there's a lot of James Lopez's out there. I can use these names, but does that necessarily mean I'm talking about the same thing? So who's a more reliable witness? So if I tell that story to somebody else who happens to know James Lopez, they're going to say, Honsberger, you're tripping here. That's not at all who James Lopez is, the guy that was on your podcast.
Wrong guy.
Yeah, completely. Well, you can figure out how this scenario works. Eyewitness testimony in a courtroom doesn't necessarily hold a lot of water. The feasibility of witnesses is always an issue. They might be lying. They might have agenda. They often, sometimes do. Forensics is usually trumps over eyewitness testimony. But nevertheless, if I'm going to take somebody seriously on a story, I would generally tend to believe the people who were there as opposed to the people who are not there. That's a simple rule of thumb, right? If anybody tells you a story, when you're a kid to now when you're an adult, to your workplace, to your marriage, anything else, if somebody tells you a story and they weren't there, how do you know? Well, I heard it from a friend. Who heard it from a friend? Heard it through the grapevine, the old song, right? We would generally take, as just a matter of common sense, people who are actually part of the scenario, people who were in that scene, they were in the house that night, they were at work that day, they were at the game that week, I would take their word before I take the word of somebody who literally was not there at all. That's pretty easy to understand. It's not hard. Every Muslim I've ever talked to gets that. If you have to, you can make the point about Muhammad. Who is a better witness about who Muhammad was? Would it be Abu Bakr? Or would it be, somebody that lived, hundreds of miles away, never even heard the name Muhammad? He would say Abu Bakr is the better testifier. He was the one with him, right? And every Muslim would say, of course. Right, that's important. So let's look at the story of the Gospels themselves and what they thought of Jesus and why did they call him God? Why is there so many references without reciting Paul, whether it's John 1 or so many other places? Why is there so many references to this man as God, not just as a prophet? And it was coming from the people who were with him. I'll say something like, in a different context, but do you consider Isaiah a prophet? Oh, of course, Isaiah, a prophet. And I said, he was a monotheist, right? Yes. So then you go to the passage in Isaiah where it talks about the Emmanuel, mighty God, eternal Father, Prince of Peace, all this wonderful language, right? Wonderful counsel, that whole passage there. So how is a monotheist talking about a child being born and calling that child mighty God? How does that make sense from a monotheistic point of view? And of course, they don't have any answer other than say Paul corrupted it. So all these texts we bring up. So anyways, we're always going to run into that issue. But to me, the simple argument, who should I take seriously? The people who were there and people who weren't there. I'm going to go with the people who were there as a rule of thumb. Now, secondly, the time part of this. Okay, so not only were they there, but they were contemporaneous with Jesus, as opposed to somebody basically 600 years later, removed by hundreds and hundreds of miles, claiming that he got the inside story on what was really happening with Jesus. Now, some of you are familiar with the Rancher readers and stuff like this, who claim that their two characters, their two spirit guides, whatever you want to call them, they knew the real story. 1900 years later in a Chicago psychiatrist's office. Well, that's credibility if I've ever heard of it. And that's just not. So which is the more likely story? Which is the more reasonable story to assume the person who was there at the same time, as opposed to somebody who wasn't there 600 years after the fact? And Muslims generally will follow this practice for a little while here because it just makes more sense. And they know it. They're not dumb. They understand this quite well. So I'm going to argue that the people who are with Jesus at the same time, in the same places, are more reliable witnesses about who Jesus actually is, as opposed to somebody who wasn't there at all. They understand that argument. It makes sense. And they don't like it necessarily, but it does make sense to most of the ones I've ever talked to. Now, again, I don't have a magic wand that makes all Muslims just drop to their knees and repent, but
What?
it does make them think about stuff. And I'm cribbing from other people, George Swissney, and other people that I've met over the years that have their approach to Islam and talking to Muslim, and that kind of stuff. All right, so I guess I should add on that point. If you watch Sam Shamoun, who I recommend highly, and you get upset because Sam is insulting and Sam is loud.
Oh yeah.
Yes, but that is not insulting in the Muslim world. That is normal. It's very easy to talk to people this way, and I've had some of those conversations where people raise their voice. And if you're a good American Christian, you're freaking out already. Oh my gosh, she's so harsh. He's so bad. It's actually normal discourse for them. It really is. So don't worry about that kind of thing. Muslims often say that Christians are practical atheists. What do they mean by that? We don't wear our religion. We don't wear our religion on our sleeves like Muslims tend to do. They're very public. Whether you're Shia, you're beating yourself with chains, or all these other bizarre things, or you're Sunnah. It's very public. It's always for everyone to see. Whereas Christians are told to go into their closet and pray. It's private. So you guys might as well be atheists. You don't live your faith. And unfortunately, that's a half truth there. There are certainly people that resemble all of that. But so we want to be public, and I don't mind being loud if I'm talking to Muslims. Another bit of advice I learned years ago from some other fellows that had this great seminar on this, who live in Lebanon and were talking to Muslims all the time. I don't talk to more than one or two Muslims ever at a time. I take them out to dinner, invite them to my house, have the Uber ride, because you get that dynamic larger than that. And what happens is if you see somebody starting to hear the argument, starting to really respond, you can see it in their face and their eyes and stuff like this. The other Muslims will see that as well. And they will freak. And they will start yelling and chanting and threatening. And the Muslim will back off. So I've seen a little bit of that. And I've learned a lot. So you know what? I'm going to talk to one or two at a time. Privately, take them to dinner, whatever. I had many dinners with Wahi Khan, stuff like this. That's where I'd rather have the discussion. So it does take away some of the group problems. All right. So on the deity of Christ, does the scriptures teach this? Yes, it does. To outsiders. So if I had to go to outside influences, whether it's Tacitus or Josephus or all these other characters, there's so many people talking about this idiot, stupid, irrational Christians who believe that this crucified carpenter was actually God. And it's outrageous to them. And so in their outrage, they're basically telling us that what it is that those early Christians, the ones who were closest to Jesus, were believing and teaching. They believed he was God. They talked like he was God. The early church letters, the Ante-Nicene Fathers are full of this language in the sermons, in the letters to governors, and the letters to military leaders. The early church was very bold about making this claim that Jesus was God. They didn't back off it. And I remember reading this quote several years ago where, I can't remember which Roman wag it was, but he was claiming what a good thing it is for us as the empire to be slaughtering this people. This is like 150, 160 AD or something like that. It's such a good thing for us to kill him for a couple of reasons. But the number one is they think this guy is God and him alone, which points to the next step there on the outline, exclusive salvation in Christ. Because then he turns around and says, they dishonor our gods. They don't think our gods are worthy. Only their God is worthy. Well, again, that points to what it is the early church was teaching. He has a critique that's heavily pointing to what the early church is teaching, that Jesus, in fact, is God, and that he is the only way, period, in the discussion. And they're willing to die for it. And the Romans were willing to kill for it. And that's very indicative of what the early church believes. So when Muslims want to claim that the church corrupted them, in particular Paul corrupts, you can actually find some of these quotes, especially Josephus or people like that, earlier than all sorts of other stuff. You see them pointing towards these weird Christians who are believing these weird things. So I'm going to talk about some of that kind of stuff, but I'll bring it up when I get to the judgment day in a few minutes here. All right, so I have here on the outline, historical response, comparison of Christ with Muhammad. Now, this is a huge thing in missions itself. So I've been a missionary for a long time. The Conservative Baptist mission, and there's this whole argument called C1 to C6, this contextualization argument. And C1, make them wear suits and ties, put them in pews, and sing, speak only King James or something silly like this. And C6 is they're going to believe in Isa, but they're going to keep the fast. They're going to keep the Hajj. They're going to even go on jihad, They're going to say the Shahada publicly. They're going to do everything that a Muslim is going to do, but they secretly pray to Isa when they're in the mosque on Fridays. They will not get baptized. They'll make no public profession. So these are the extremes. And I remember George Hussein and I talking about this many years ago and how frustrating it was in my own mission. The conservative Baptists were kind of leaning towards C6. And I'm like, no, that ain't right. But all right, so having said that, many ministries, many people who talk to Muslims think it's the worst possible thing to do to criticize Muhammad. They think you've lost the conversation already. And in many circles that I'm very familiar with, you should not criticize Joseph Smith or the Buddha himself or Sun Myung Moon. You know, you're going to lose them on that initial conversation.
Speaking of losing,
because generally all these people are bad. They're bad people. They're really bad people. In the case of Muhammad, they're incredibly bad people. And if a Muslim wants to argue that, I'm having them defend marrying a 6-year-old girl, defend, marrying your former adopted son's wife that you basically, changed your doctrines just so you could have his wife, defend the sex slaves, defend the rape and murder of entire villages, defend having black slaves and ridiculing them. That's also in the hadith. Defend any of these things, please. Show me how Muhammad was really a good guy. And they're going to have a hard time. And so I'm going to compare them to Jesus, because Muslims will actually say they believe that Jesus did miracles, that Jesus was holy, that Jesus, they say all sorts of wonderful things about Jesus, but they say it from afar because most Muslims have never read anything in the New Testament. And many Muslims haven't even read the Qur'an or the hadith. They just go with what the Imam says or the Mullah, depending on the version. So I'm going to try to get into the New Testament to read actually what it says. I'll be pointing out the Old Testament as well, but I want to talk about who Jesus is. I want to talk about who Jesus is all day long. I want to talk about Jesus loving his enemies, telling his disciples. I always try to get Muslims to the Sermon on the Mount because, Isa is the second highest prophet behind Muhammad, and Muhammad's quite violent. So by thought, Jesus must be pretty violent as well. And yet we read, and we'll get to the disciples in a second, we read where Jesus tells us to pray for our enemies, to pray and bless those who persecute you. Words that never hear from Muhammad. You don't see anything like that from Muhammad. Muhammad says Allah wants you to slaughter your enemies, anybody who opposes you, all sorts of language, all through the hadith, all through the several parts of the Quran, stuff like this. So Muhammad.
Hey, Bill?
Yes.
I just wanted to interject something. It was a long time ago in the lecture here. You said you highly recommended we listen to this guy. He might be kind of abrasive in that. Can you put a link in the below this, or send me a link to who that guy is? Because I didn't capture his name.
Well, the link is on the bottom of the outline, Jeff. It's answeringislam.org. That's Sam Shamoon.
Okay. All right. Got it. Thank you.
Like I said, Sam's he's a trip.
yeah,
He's very smart. He's very smart, and he's very good at debating and stuff like this.
very good.
And he's very brash.
He is very brash and abrasive, but that's
he comes at him. Yeah.
In their world,
thanks.
That's not the problem. They're not mad at him because he's abrasive. They're mad at him because he's insulting Muhammad.
Right.
Anyway, so I don't want to see necessarily as insulting Muhammad as much as I want to say this is who the man is. This is what he did. If they're honest, if they're honest about their own beliefs, which is not always the case, taqiya, lying is okay. But if they're honest, they know darn well that inside the Arabic world itself, Muhammad having 100 women, it was fine. In fact, if only I could be like the prophet and I could have sex with all these women in one night type stuff. That's a prayer. That's an actual statement they make. If only I could be a warrior's warrior and kill all the enemies of Allah and this kind of stuff. That's how they talk amongst themselves. Of course, they never talk that way in the West. We're not supposed to know any of these kind of attitudes that are so common, but amongst themselves. And I think it's always instructive, whatever religion we're talking, how do they talk amongst themselves as opposed to what they're presenting to us, the PR job. All right, so there's, Jesus did miracles. Muhammad did not. Jesus loved his enemies. Muhammad did not. Jesus provides an atonement. This is maybe one of the most critical things I want to say tonight that I've had with many Muslims. Again, I mentioned the first day that Muhammad's early message was really simple. One God and judgment day is coming. So most Muslims wear this on their sleeves. Their fear of judgment is overwhelming. It's enough to send them to wrap themselves in C4 and walk into a pizza parlor and blow it up. Okay, that's a serious thing. That's something that they take very, in an incredible way that most Christians don't ever think about the second coming of Christ with the same fervor that an average Muslim might take about Judgment Day itself. So in this case, a Muslim's going to face Allah someday. He's got one jinn or angel, depending on who you read, on one shoulder telling all of their, abilities to do the pillars, to keep the prayers, all this stuff. And the other jinn, I mentioned this before, but the other jinn is mentioning all their sins. So Muslims aren't Hindus or Buddhists. They're not denying sin necessarily, but we have a different list of sins, obviously. And so, he was drinking, and he didn't get up for the morning prayers, and he did this and he did this. So I mentioned this also before. In front of Allah, you're being judged by your sins. You're terrified of hell, and you should be. And you're so wanting, paradise, so you can have sex with your perpetual virgins and all this kind of stuff. All right, so simplifying that whole thing, a Muslim knows that he stands before Allah alone on the basis of his own works. And you know what? I don't care what human being you're talking about. I would be terrified, and I don't know anybody who could stand before God and say, I'm just going to stand here on my, on my sins as opposed to my goodness. I'm sorry. I know exactly what I am. I am a complete wretch, sinner, completely at war with God my entire existence. The Lord in his mercy and grace rescued me from myself. Okay. So I have that sensibility as well. I would be terrified. And I tell them, man, if I were you, I would be so scared of standing before God one day, weighing out my sins as opposed to this. This is why it's so important. And that's why I'm going to go to the Gospels. When John the Baptist, prophet, right? And when the Apostle John, when they see Jesus, what do they say? What kind of things do they say? Oh, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sin of the world. Oh, this is the Word of God who was with God, who was God, right? They say all these amazing things about who Jesus is. And they say it's Messiah, Mashiach. What does that mean? It means atonement. What does that mean? It means covering. That, in fact, I stand before God, not alone with my sin, overwhelming me, but I stand there because Jesus has covered me. Do you have a covering? Do you guys have a covering? What is your covering? What protects you from the judgment of God? And oh, by the way, I mentioned before the verse in the Hadith: you might be as hair's breadth from paradise, but Allah sends you to hell. Inshallah, you might be a hair's breadth from hell, but Allah sends you to paradise. Inshallah, you have no certainty of anything in the Muslim faith. They know that too. It scares them. So again, the willingness to die is the only time for sure you gain paradise. Allah would not lie, which might beg the question, why not? He's lied all these other times. You brag about him lying, but this is what they think, is that Allah could do this. He's capricious in this way. So I'm going to talk about Jesus as a covering a lot, that he's paid for the price for our sins. That's the whole point of the cross. It wasn't somebody being substituted like many Muslims think. He himself paid for our sins, that there was a reason. Now, a larger version of this that I learned from some other fellows who were talking to Muslims, a great thought, and it's one where you raise your voice. And I've done this to some cabbies and some other people. I did this in Toronto many, many years ago with a cabbie up there, a Somali fella, and we had a great talk. He stopped the cab. We talked for a long time. So you kind of look at him and you do this. So you think you're greater than Abraham, don't you? And they lose it. I mean, their eyes get big. Of course, no Muslim can ever possibly say that I'm greater than Muslim. And you go, no, I would never say that. Yes, you do. You think you're better than Abraham, don't you?
No.
Oh, they are freaking, James. They are getting so upset because the concept, even as a thought for a minute, just freaks them out. My gosh, I would never say such a horrible thing. Why are you saying this about me? And I wear them down with it 3 or 4 times, raising my voice. You think you're better. And then after they're emotionally,
drained,
heart attack, I say, why do I, you ask me why I would do this, why I would think this about you? Because Abraham sacrificed and Moses sacrificed. And, just going down the list, pick 4 or 5, all of them sacrificed for their sins. Where is your sacrifice? Oh, you have no sacrifice for your sins? Oh, you're better than Abraham, aren't you? Because he sacrificed for his sins.
Uh-oh.
You see the problem it's put them in? And again, this is where getting emotional can be helpful to them. They appreciate that because you're really pointing to a really serious issue. What covering do I have for my sin? I have none. if I'm Muslim. But all these Old Testament guys, even Jesus himself, does the sacrifices that the law required and this kind of stuff, but you guys don't. So you must be better than Abraham. It's a simple conclusion that they, don't want to face up to. So I want to focus on that. I want to focus on the idea that Jesus is our covering. And there's several people that have written small tracts and books about this issue online if you want to find them. But it's an important concept because, again, El Ha, I think is the name of this concept, that you have to have a sacrifice for your sin. The Bible's full of that language, which is why we as Christians see Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice for our sins. But Muslims don't have that, do they? And so that's what I'm asking my Muslim friend here. Say, you have no covering? I would be terrified too. I would never want to stand in front of Allah without some protection from my own behavior, from my own choices, my own evil. And that's language they understand. It's language they understand a lot. And it does put you in a desperate place. And like I said, I'd be desperate too. So I truly appreciate that. So who Jesus is and what he did is very critical. What did Muhammad do about our sin? Why, that would be nothing. What did Muhammad tell us to have a covering? No. Does he provide a covering? No. You're judged on your works. Period. End of discussion. Here's the grocery list. Oh, you didn't keep it? Well, it sucks to be you. It's really simple at that point. And even if you keep the list, you may not make it. Oh, well, tough break for you. Inshallah. It's a horrific, psychological mind-crushing concept with what Islam offers on this level to the average Muslim. So I want to focus on who he is. And I have no problem criticizing Muhammad's teachings as well as his behavior. Okay. So next one, comparison of Christ's disciples with Muhammad's disciples. This is also very important because, again, what did the people around him, how did they act? All right. So when I was at the atheist conference in April, one of the things that famous atheists, whether it's Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, they'll always talk this way. Well, religion does this and religion does that. And I'm like, guys, so I'm talking to two of these bigwigs at the atheist convention. Like, guys, that is so imprecise. It wasn't this Little Sisters of the Poor at 9/11, You can't be talking this way. Certain religions do this and other religions don't. That's like saying all atheists are the same, which they know better than that. Or for that matter, all Jews are the same. All, Buddhists are the same. All Baptists are the same. Ain't happening. Okay. All people blessed enough to be Yankee fans are the same. No.
Hey.
They should all.
I think they are the same.
They should all be with me. Yeah, some of you non-believers, don't see God's sovereignty.
We're credulous.
Okay. So just count to 27, fellas, and you'll figure this out. Yeah. All right. So what were the people like that followed Jesus? What did they do? Did they go on jihad? Did they go on an attack? Did they spread the faith through slaughtering the people who did not respond to their new message? Why, no, they didn't. In fact, it was converse. The exact opposite happens. They're getting killed all over the place. They're being chased all over the place. None of them are getting rich. Sorry, Benny and Kenny. They're not living their best life now. They're often being chased down and slaughtered. And virtually when Jesus is standing in Matthew 28, when he's standing on the hill, they're talking to the guys and sending him out on what Christians commonly call the Great Commission. He knows darn well that within 30 years, virtually all of them are dead as he sends them out to their mission. But they were not the killers. They were not the people leading fights. They were not conquering land for the sake of Allah or any God. Now let's compare that with Abu Bakr and Uthman and Omar and all the early disciples of Muhammad, all of his buddies. Well, they're out conquering. The war of apostates first for the tribes that were sneaking away after Muhammad dies. And then they spread this. And within 6 years, they've taken the Holy Lands. And I've mentioned this the first couple of weeks with the history. These guys are spreading violence virtually everywhere you go, slaughtering people right and left. What Muhammad did to the Jews at Khaybar is an obscenity beyond belief, killing, estimates are anywhere from 600 to 800 of the Jewish men of that one tribe. Every boy that had not reached puberty, every boy that had reached puberty already was beheaded. And Muhammad killed so many of them, setting the good example since he's the perfect man, that only when he couldn't even lift up his own sword, this is their story, it's not mine. Only when he could not lift up his own sword anymore did he allow the other guys, here's the guys that are going to be the Khalifs, Muhammad's closest friends. Now you guys get to take some heads. It's an obscene story. The Muslims recount to this moment, and they threaten Jews with it. all over the world. There's so many accounts of this. Oh, Jews, remember Kaibar and all this kind of stuff. They know their history. They play the long game.
Mm.
Anyways, so I look at the people that Jesus followed who are being slaughtered for the faith, as opposed to the people that Muhammad sponsored, taught, who are out slaughtering people for theirs. Is there a difference between the two? Yeah, I think there is. I think there's a radical difference between the two. And if you left it there and only that, you could say, well, it's enough. Now, is it true that Christians later on, in many cases, have committed acts of violence? Of course it is. Without going into the whole history of the Crusades, that would take a whole another series. But the Crusades were defensive. They, 300 years of Muslims attacking Europe already. But even if I take that seriously, is it possible that Christians have disobeyed the Lord by picking up the sword to take on their enemies? Of course it is. There's historical examples. I'm not arguing that point. But are they doing what Jesus told them to do is my point. Or are they doing exactly the opposite of what Jesus told them? Now, let's compare that with what Muhammad's disciples have done to this very moment, as when they kill people who will not accept the faith and all this kind of stuff, like the Qur'an commands, like the Hadith commands and suggests and illustrates. They're doing exactly what their prophet told them to do. Okay? So, religion of peace, all that silly talk. I'm just making a point that let's look at this, my Muslim friend. Do you think it's better to kill people or to be kind to them? Most Muslims I've talked to are resonating with this kind of thing. They have a conscience. It's in there according to Romans 2. And I'm just basically bringing them back to their conscience that's been suppressed in Romans 1:16. It's been suppressed by bad teaching, but underneath there's a conscience. They know it's wrong to rape. They know it's wrong to murder. They know it's wrong to lie. Go right down the line. So I'm going to try to get down to that conscience and pointing to how the students who were taught by the masters themselves acted. I think you can see a pretty major distinction between the two as well. All right, so there's so much more to all this, but response to the Muslim Apologists: Islam is a religion of peace. Well, I kind of just illustrated that. And when George Bush stood on the ruins of the World Trade Center, and Islam's a religion of peace that's been hijacked by these people, by terrorists, and I'm like, I remember listening to that talk. Everybody in the world was listening to that talk, and I remember thinking, surely he has better people in the White House that know this better. Surely he knows darn well that Islam does not mean peace. Salam is the Arabic word for peace. Islam means submission. We talked about this the first week. And I can't, I know what's going on. This is very political. They're trying to, we're going to kill these people, but not these people. They're trying to make a distinction here. But tough one to make when, and there's entire websites dedicated to this, that so many of the attacks, are they all done by Muslims? No. We have to throw in the people over in Sri Lanka and other places just doing these kind of things. But again, it is not the little sisters of the poor walking into Pizza Huts and blowing up as many Jews as they can. Okay. There's so many illustrations. We just had this horrible firebombing of a elderly Jewish crowd in Boulder, Colorado this last month. And the guy get caught doing it. Every single one of these, those guys shot up a mall in Boulder a few years ago, Muslim fellow. Every single time I can think of in the country when a Muslim in our country here in the U.S. has done something like this, he's mentally unstable. Why? He had a whole history. But I don't read this about Buddhist guys or, Christian murderers. I don't ever hear generally this kind of defense, but it seems like, wow, every Muslim we're talking about here is crazy. Is there a pattern here? Maybe is that indicative of the larger? I don't make that mistake either, but it's funny how this always works. It's hard to find Islam as a religion of peace. I quote Sam Huntington, who was hounded at the University at Harvard, when he says Islam is a religion with bloody borders. And he's been despised for saying that because he can't reveal what's the actual truth. He can't reveal how the Crusades are a response to Muslim aggression for hundreds of years at that point. You can't talk about so many counts of Muslims taking slaves in Ireland, in Scotland, in England, literally coming up from up the coast and taking slaves all over the place. You can't talk about what they did to the women in Spain that they captured and all this kind of, you're not supposed to bring that kind of stuff up because the overarching theme is, well, Islam's a religion of peace and those are just liars and all that kind of stuff. Well, again, when you have virtually everybody throughout world history who's not a Muslim talking this way, perhaps there's a little bit of truth in there, fellas. Maybe we need to take it. And again, in their world, they know better. There's the Dar al-Harb, the House of the Sword, the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam. They know darn well that the Dar al-Harb is where Jihad is practiced to bring the whole world into the Dar al-Islam, into the other house, so that everybody can worship, follow Allah by doing Sharia, keeping the grocery list, so you can gain the, very earthly paradise. Okay, so I'm just running along here, but Islam is not a religion of peace. It's hard to find that. There's 57 Muslim countries. Please show me inside a Muslim country where there's peace. It's very difficult to find. Iraq is a perfect example of that. If you go back to the history of the Iraq-Iran war in early 1980 or 81, somewhere back whenever that was, you can find all these in-house fights amongst Muslim Brotherhood and other Muslims in Egypt. There's a long history of different characters saying, I'm the Mahdi, and killing everybody who disagrees with me. A tremendously long history. There's a long history of them killing the Baha'i. Are the Baha'is Looney Tune for some of their beliefs? Yeah. But the Iranian attitude, the Shia attitude, is to kill them because they claim that their prophet's later and more superior to that. The same thing with the Ahmadiyya Muslims in Pakistan, who come out of the Sunni tradition with the same kind of claim. Our guy's the newest, latest, greatest thing since sliced bread. And, they'll slaughter them. The whole understanding of the Sikh religion was trying to get Muslims and Hindus to keep from killing each other. Well, the Hindus were in India. How are the Muslims doing over there? Why does everybody in Egypt speak Arabic, and all across North Africa? Why do they speak Arabic? Islam spread nicely? No, they were never a religion of peace. They've been a religion of violent expansion since virtually their entire opening moments. And the fact that Muhammad, we talked about this early on, the fact that he literally commanded, once he took over the army in the city of Medina, he literally commands 82 different battles, almost all of them with the Quraysh, his tribe in Mecca. Wow, that's Gandhi, right? That's so peaceful. It wasn't even as peaceful as the media presents him. But nevertheless, Muhammad is not a man of peace, and Islam is not a man of peace. And they know that, and they talk about it, and they're not shy about it amongst themselves. So it's very important, again, how do they talk amongst themselves? And pointing this out is not that hard. Again, if you really want to push this internet-wise, there's entire websites dedicated to list of Muslim violence throughout history. Yeah, question there?
One of the Reddit pages that I sometimes explore is called r/x Muslim, and as it sounds like, there's a bunch of people coming out of Islam and stuff. And there was one, I think it was a TikTok video that was posted by someone who had come out of Islam, and basically, she was saying that she had finally realized that the Muslims were colonizers, like the early ones that were following Mohammed. But the difference between them and other colonizers or whatever, because I'm pretty sure this woman is on the left, is that they were more successful in their colonization of everything.
Well, that sure justifies everything.
To your point of why pretty much the entirety of North Africa speaks Arabic.
Sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, and again, they don't hide that amongst themselves. This is Allah's will. Sharia must be imposed upon the world. The whole world must and will someday. Again, they play the long game. So they will someday. The Muslims will rule the world. Allah will be happy. Everybody will practice Sharia. But even if I said that, well, which version of Sharia? Right?
Right.
Because Muslims kill each other over that kind of thing. Muslims have been killing each other for a long time, and then they kill Jews and Christians and pagans and everybody else. But it's hard to find a time in Muslim history. So I was watching an apologist many years ago for Islam talk about the glory of Andalusia, which is Spain, all the rest of us. Muslims conquered all of Spain, a little city at a time, boom, 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 boom. And they were finished with all of Spain by 711. Okay, so this is within 80 years of Muhammad's death. And they talked about this documentary on PBS. It was talking about this whole thing about Andalusia. It was a time of peace between Muslims and Jews and Christians, and everybody got along. And then those darn Christians screwed it up. Well, I'm not here to sing the praises of Philip and Isabella any more than anybody else. They were not good to Jews or anybody, as far as I'm concerned. But Islam was a time of Andalusia was a time of peace. Yeah, stick your head up and see what happens in Spain. Read Maimonides or Rambam to Jewish people. Read what he said as a captain. There's so many other accounts of people who are there, stomped on by the Muslims. Yeah, as a dhimmi, a second-class citizen, as a Jew or Christian, can you have a time of peace? As long as you do exactly what you're told. As long as you don't get on a horse higher than a Muslim in the neighborhood. As long as you don't repair a door that's been broken in by Muslim, attackers at your church, or a whole bunch of other things, and dare not try to tell people about Jesus as he's who he says he is. That'll get you killed quick. So as long as you do exactly, as long as you're basically a good slave, and Muslims call themselves slaves to Allah, so that's I'm not picking on them, but they expect dhimmis to pay the jizya, the tax, which is determined by whoever the local ruler is. You pay the tax, keep your head down. Sure, we'll be peaceful towards you, unless we want one of your daughters for our wives. Well, then that changes everything too. So ask the Coptics in Egypt what that looks like. Ask Muslims, or Christians in Nigeria, even in just the last couple of years, what that looks like when Muslims decide that your daughters are their brides. Again, you can be peaceful all over the place as long as you do exactly what you're told, and you still might get nailed for it. So it's never been a religion of peace at any time I can think of in recorded history. Now, if you want to find me 5 minutes where Muslims aren't killing, I'll give you a counter argument for a second. I had this at the college of one of the professors. So if it was true, Bill, that Islam's a religion of violence, like you say it is, why there's 1.6 at this time, 1.6 billion Muslims, and they'd be all over the place, killing people right and left. Well, there's this interesting, thought to that whole point. But my response is something like this: wait a second. I've already argued that not all Muslims follow their religion seriously, just like not all Christians do, or all Jews do, or all Buddhists do, or all atheists do. People tend to, be all over the map on how serious they are about their own religious convictions, their own lack of religious convictions, their own moral convictions. People are always doing stuff like that. They're always compromising their own faith or lack thereof. So is it true that, it would be a much more bloody world? If all of them, of course it would. It'd also be a much more bloody world if 2.2 million so-called Christians were out slaughtering Muslims right and left. We'd have a real fun world, wouldn't we? But most Christians, I say this as a Christian minister, most Christians do not follow the faith. And if I'm honest, there's a lot of times I don't follow my own faith. There have been many times like that where I have to seek the Lord's forgiveness, like Mohammed did. That's another story. Muslims don't accept that. So I'm going to argue that, it is the case when Christians have violence, but it's against the command of God, whereas for Muhammad, it is for the command of God. This is really wonderful. So when Islam is a religion of peace, no, show me a time. Show me a place where Muslims have not expanded and kept trying to expand. You can argue at many times, some of the fights in Vienna and some of the fights in the city of Baghdad when the Mongols came through. Oh, what an ugly story that is. Muslims have been stopped in their expansion, and then it's relatively peaceful because they just got their butts kicked. They're not going to fight anymore until they get there. So we're going to sign a peace treaty here soon. Watch the language. If you go to memory.org or one of those websites to see the language in Arabic that's used for the peace treaty, if you see the word hudna, Hudnah in English, if you see that word, you know what's going on. It's not a peace treaty at all. Muhammad said, when you're weak in your army, you don't have the military force to take over a particular area, sign a treaty of peace. And then go back and build up your army, get your supplies together, get your men trained so you can go back again. It's just a temporary timeout. Let us get our act together so we can kill you next time,
Right. Do it right.
Yeah, and so I watched Arafat say that numerous times when he was allegedly signing peace treaties. It's a hudna is different than an actual peace treaty. So it's not a religion of peace. It never has been. And like I said, all you have to do is look at history, and you don't have to be a Christian to see this. You can certainly ask Jews. You can ask a lot of ex-Muslims. You can ask a lot of historians throughout time. You can read Thomas Aquinas 800 years ago, and read all sorts of other people talking about Islam's proclivity towards war wherever it goes. And again, for the Muslims, it's win-win, like we talked about with the sixth, pillar. If I win in this life and I stay alive, well, I get lots of extra women and stuff. If I get killed, I get lots of extra women and stuff. It's a total win-win for them to spread violence. Secondly, and this is all across our media, of course, is that Islam is being slandered by Christians. Now, when I was teaching at the college I was at, I was explicitly told by the dean that I had to be very careful when I talked about jihad and all this with Islam. Bill, you have to say the number 10%. I said, where does that number even come from? Well, the school is telling us that we have to use the language 10%. And I said, well, I don't buy it. We have no way to quantify this at all. It's not, don't talk about science or anything. There's no way to quantify this number. But let's suppose that's true. Let's do a reductio here and suppose that it's actually true that it's only 10%. Well, at this point, there's 1.6 billion Muslims. All the great news is there's only 160 million people who want to kill us. Great. More than the entire population of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, World War II. So wonderful. This is a lame number. It comes out of space, comes out of thin air. But let's ask about the argument from Islam being slandered. Okay, so it's what I love about so many guys online, be it Sam Shimon or David Wood or Jay Smith or these guys, when they give references from Muslim sources about every single thing they say. So when we talk about Aisha, here's the references in the Qur'an and Hadith. When it talks about Muhammad, slaughtering the Jews at Khaybar, you give absolute references in their own text from their own stories. Okay, so how am I slandering when I'm quoting your guys? These are your people. What I was told when I did that with the Qur'an itself, again, most of this gigantic Qur'an is commentary because the book is not put together chronologically. And so the thing up here. When I quote this and I quote something in English, of course, I'm being told when I quote something that's embarrassing, then I'm told that it's not Arabic, so it's not really Allah's word. I'm like, it's your translation. Yeah, but it's not Allah's word. But it's you guys published this. You guys, did the whole thing. You're spreading this book as if it's true. So it's a dodge. It's a dodge that they have to use to get out of some uncomfortable situations they have in their own text, like all the words about violence. So if you want to say it's unchristian, it's slanderous to call Muslims nonviolent. All right. Well, let's look at what the Quran says. All right. Let's look at Surah 27 or 27. So many other passages I can't go into. It literally commands them to violence. It commends them in violence. It rewards them for violence. So is that a slander if I'm quoting your own people? What about the sex slaves? What about the situation with his daughter, Zayd's wife? What about all these different situations that they brag about? Now, I saw this one. I had not heard this before, but I saw this recently from David Wood and some of the guys about what looks like a lot of homosexual encounters with Muhammad. New one on me. I had not heard that one before. Somebody wrote in, Islam is against homosexuality. You're just lying. Well, again, they're quoting the Quran itself. They're quoting the hadiths, all sorts of critical hadiths that are considered strong hadiths. That means it's really true by most Muslims. So if you're quoting their own sources to show a certain issue about Muhammad's attitude about women or sex or anything, then how is it slanderous? It's slanderous if you report something that's not true. Okay. It's, if you printed, of course, slander and libel and all that kind of fun stuff. But what if you're telling what's true? It's slander at this point. It's literally just that. Well, again, it doesn't matter because that's when the voices get raised and people get upset. Again, I'm going to offend them in all sorts of ways, but I want the offense to be close to the heart of what it is they teach as opposed to what God tells us to teach. Mm-hmm. And then this last one, said by President Bush, Islam is being misrepresented by hijackers, these terrorists.
Radicals.
Yeah. The moment about this is that the Quran explicitly says to terrorize people in English. It does at least a couple of places that I've seen. How is that misrepresenting what it is their own text tells them to do? Now, again, if I'm as a Christian, I go out and I beat somebody up or something in the name of Jesus, I'm going to contact witnessing. I've always wanted that option.
Yeah.
So, if I were to do that, it would be explicitly going against.
Would that be like evangelism with a punch?
Oh, terrible done. I think the podcast should be pun free, frankly.
Oh God!
We have to keep the intellectual level a little bit higher than that, Don. So,
anyway,
Mark Rogaman, who works with me in Haven,
it's just funny to me. That's why. That's
funny.
James, please cut him off. Okay, so Mark Rogaman's a Denver cop, 39 years. He's almost as tall as I am, big, strong guy. we've made this joke forever. We go to these little new age sites and we're arguing with some of your Rancher Reader, Eckankar people, and they're generally smaller than us. And like, if only the Lord allowed just a little bit of full contact witnessing, it would be so much easier than trying to reason with people who are irrational,
Yeah.
In the name of Jesus, go, full Knights Templar on these people, but we're not allowed to do that kind of thing. All right. So I look at this whole thing and I say, okay, what is it they say themselves? Again, they say themselves it's important to terrorize people. It works. You know what? They're right. And anybody who's been picked on by a school bully knows exactly what phenomenon we're talking about. I worked primarily in a jail as the deputy sheriff. You know what? Terror goes on every single moment. All right. And sometimes even by the good guys. I found at my height at 6'4", and I found that if I raised my voice and got up on my tippy toes to look even taller, I avoided so many more fights than if I'd been the same size as the guy. You know what? It's intimidation. And I'm not here to brag about it. I'm here to point out the human phenomena of people bullying others has been around forever and is with us today. So when you talk about cutting people's heads off in front of others, you know what? The Saudis do this on a routine basis right now. Okay, the Iranians do this on a routine basis. You are telling the thief, we're going to take your hand because you stole. We're going to take your head because you did this. You committed, you committed rape. This never happens, unfortunately. It's always the one that gets nailed. But we're going to take your life. We're going to take your hand as a way of basically telling you and telling everybody else in the audience that's watching, because there's always a big public thing when the Saudis, for example, do this, that you should be so scared of stealing next time. You should be so scared of doing all these terrible things. It's terror. Okay, it works. It's actually a good way of inspiring people, usually to do the wrong thing. And in this case, the hijackers, do what they do. They terrorize. Of course they do. They hold up weapons. It scares people. Yeah, it does. It actually does scare people. It always has. So these people are not hijacking a religion. They're literally the most serious. Yeah. I tell my classes, I said, whether you want to hear this or not, these are the people who actually believe their own faith. And all you have to do is listen to ISIS for the last 10 years or more. Watch their videos if you have an incredibly strong stomach. And if you could speak Arabic, you would hear them bragging about, we're doing exactly what Mohammed did. Why don't you come alongside? Why don't you get serious about your own faith? Like I told you this example, like the FLDS talking to the LDS. Same type thing. Hey, we're doing what Joseph did. Where are you guys at? What do you mean you can't have lots of wives? Okay, so they are hijackers. They're not representing anything. They're actually the most serious representatives of the Islamic faith that I can think of. It's the Muslim who won't get involved in violence and won't get involved in all these kind of things. That is actually doing the opposite of what Muhammad said to do. And they know it, and they preach that every Friday in the mosque, And all you have to do is read memory.org, read the sermons coming out of the mosque in Cairo and, some other video, whatever, and you hear the exact same thing, those kind of speeches. Inspiring the flock to do what Muhammad did, not hijack. Wow. Okay, so this last part, speaking the truth in love, loving your enemies. So Ephesians 4:15, explicitly for the church, keep this in context, that we would speak the truth in love one to another. I know that's for the church. Haven, we've always taken the mindset that this is good for Muslims and Buddhists and everybody else. We want to love them. We don't want to scream at them. We don't want to respond as they often do to us. Don and I and several others were accused of screaming and yelling at people at the PaganCon event this year. That we were standing up in the middle of their meetings and calling them out and calling them names. And like, no, we don't do this. We never do this. We never have done this. We don't act like this at all. But there was the Satanist trying to get us thrown out. That's a whole other fun story for a different day. In this case, you know what? It's easy to talk to people and love them. Okay. My wife is cursed with being nice. She's a very loving, very empathetic person. Thankfully, I wasn't cursed with that type of problem, but she is. So on the spectrum of speaking the truth in love, she's very big on speaking lovingly towards other people. And I'm on the other end of things. It's much easier, I'm much more driven by analytic and annoying personality that I'm going to speak the truth in love. And I can scratch these arguments in a second. It's not hard. It's hard to bite your tongue, not to end the discussion is the hard part. So when you're talking to, so, Prophet Billy Bob says 2 + 2 is 7, no, you're an idiot. No, I can't say that. I can never say that because I don't want to end the conversation. I'm not interested in ending a conversation. I want to keep talking. So I can speak the truth pretty well, I think, but the command of the apostle here for how we treat one another, and we argue that how we should treat others as well, is to do both. To temper your truth telling, as it were, with love. That this person is going to hear what you need them to hear, what the Lord wants them to hear, hopefully, but they're going to hear it in a way that makes them think, or at least hopefully makes them think that you don't hate them because you disagree with them. It's a hard concept. And it's hard for us as believers, as Christians too. So to engage with Muslims, and you want to get them to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. You want them to have a covering. You want them to know who the Lord actually is. And that's amazing. So I don't get lost in politics with them. I don't get lost in all sorts of other things, because again, that's all sidebar issues with them. I do want to talk about who Jesus actually is. And loving your enemies is what Jesus says to do, which is why every time I've talked to a Muslim, I try to get them back to the Sermon on the Mount, because I want them to hear what the real voice of God says, as opposed to what Muhammad said.
Right.
And, Jesus' second highest pride. Let's look what he said. Oh, it contradicts what Muhammad said. Weird. I thought, they were the same thing. So I'm always going to try to keep that in mind as I'm talking to people. And again, great rides with these cab drivers, the most recent conversations I've had with Muslims, all focusing back on who Jesus really is, what do people around him say about him, as opposed to the Qur'an 600 years later, hundreds of miles away, blah, 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 blah. But I'm really confident, since I had really friendly conversations. I gave all these guys my card. They all wanted my card. They wanted the ability to keep talking to me. And yeah, absolutely, guys. I want them to come away thinking that way. When I had this argument with this really aggressive anti-theist, anti-Christian, especially Aaron Ra at the Atheist Convention, he comes up afterward, after I've been basically not only sharing my testimony, but really taking apart some of the atheist claims. He came up and gave me a big bear hug. And if you watch this guy's videos, that he's not given to doing that kind of thing. The bear hug is with a boot in the butt, So I would like them to know and understand. Even when Mo, the Satanist, tried to get us thrown out, I told the lady, said, hey, I'll have lunch with Mo. Let me take him out. I'll meet with him. Because I actually take that seriously. I don't want him to think I'm his enemy or hate him in any way. One of the things that Don and I and all of us that were there at Paganacon have said and continue to say is, we know they've been burned by Christians. We are here to try to change that conception of who Christians really are and actually love these people. We care for them. Do we think what they're doing is wrong? So it's okay to say that, but we don't want our hatred of their attitudes, their beliefs, them as persons to be what comes through, because that's not right. I can more than easily criticize the
Oh, you just went
and
Presbyterian on us.
do it about our country. Sorry?
You were frozen for a moment. One of the frozen chosen.
Did. Oh no.
Yeah, just for a moment.
Inshallah. What can I say? Oh, I'm sorry. All right. So some of the specific things here. The Quran is the completion of the revelation of God. Again, another argument I picked up from some other fellows that fits in with this Tarif thing. It's hard to talk to a Muslim about what the New Testament says. Because again, they're always going to fall back on the motif. So if since according to Muslims, and this is another important idea of abrogation, and abrogation means, because Muhammad contradicts himself so often in his revelations, the Muslims came up with this idea that the last thing that Muhammad said about a subject overrides or abrogates the earlier things. Earlier people of the book, Jews and Christians, and that's always quoted in our media. Jews and Muslims have no problem with Jews and Christians. Why, look, they're people of the book, Cathabia. He said that early on when he's trying to get their support. When they don't sign up with them, kill them, And the latter is what is more important. It abrogates the earlier attitudes. And he did this repeatedly on adoption with his, his former daughter-in-law, all this kind of fun stuff.
Well, and just as a side note, by the way, they're not the only ones that do that. You've got the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. This is the same thing. We have new light.
Exactly.
So what we taught 2 months ago was true then. It just may not be true today because we have new light.
It's just a different way of abrogation.
The living prophet in Mormonism, if he contradicts the earlier prophets, well, that's okay. And whether the Catholics want to admit it or not, and they usually don't, do the councils get contradicted? Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Oh, well. I'm so thankful I've never contradicted myself. Anyways, just take the argument, again, the reductive argument, start with the other person's point of view. So Allah revealed the Torah, the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. Muslims, yes, absolutely. Allah revealed the Injil, the New Testament, okay? And then Allah revealed the Quran. Why? Because the earlier versions have been corrupted. The Quran abrogates the other texts. So the stories about Noah and Moses' wife are so messed up in the Quran. Well, that's the true story because these other, other earlier texts were corrupted. So here's the interesting argument.
Does Allah have dementia?
I guess.
Because he just forgets everything.
He forgets everything. Forgets a lot of things.
Well, they wouldn't say that he forgets everything, but that he sort of updates things, or that the text was really relevant to that time, but not for all time.
Which is the minority view, sadly. I wish it was the majority view on that point, Don, especially on the verses of violence and stuff like this.
Right.
Let's just follow the thinking here, okay? And again, you can do this without being harsh, without raising your voice at this point. So my Muslim friend, please help me understand. So Allah gave the Old Testament, the Torah. That was Allah's word. Yes, we believe that. And Allah gave the Injil. That's Allah's word, right? It's just we believe it. And Allah gave the Quran. That's Allah's word. Oh, absolutely, yes. Okay, so this first one, Allah's word, got corrupted, right? Yes. And the second text, the Injil, was corrupted. Yes. So why should I take seriously the claim that the Quran itself is not also corrupted? And you say, well, if Allah is all powerful, don't you believe Allah is all powerful? Well, of course I believe Allah is all powerful. Then, okay, he could not protect his own word. Is that what you're saying? You don't believe Allah was powerful enough to protect his own word? And there's a lot of sputtering that comes up at this point because, again, having to think about this argument in a serious way. But we're not raising our voice. We're not calling them out necessarily. It's just pointing out that the claim. Second thing about the text itself on the Quran. Okay, every diet commercial in history, and I've given this to so many Muslims that are Americans that are living in America. So every diet commercial you've ever seen in your life in America will have before and after pictures. Here's the fat person. Here's the skinny version of the fat person. Every commercial. Because for the average consumer to buy into the program, whatever the program is, you want to see that it works, or at least it claims it, right? You always want to see that. So that's just the story of all these things. Whether it's an acne commercial, whatever it is, you want to see the before and after. All right. So the claim is that the Quran abrogates the earlier text, is superior, is not corrupted, all that kind of language. Okay, fine. Help me understand this now. I accept this. Could you show me the earlier versions so I can see how they were corrupted and changed? I mean, I'd love to see this. Now, this can, you can have this argument with atheists and stuff. And the average the average atheist or non-believer, well, the Bible's full of contradictions. Oh man, that's interesting. What is your favorite one? And 99% of the time, I get, it's full of contradictions. Well,
it's just there.
Now, there are people out there that can give you an argument, and have some discussions of some things, and that's an important discussion to have on a different day. But most people don't have one. They just heard that it's been full of corruptions. It's full of mistranslations. It's full of contradictions, and they run with it. We're lazy people, whether it's politically or theologically or anything else. So in this corruption of the text now, if it's corrupt, then you should be able to show me so I can take you seriously. I'm so willing, my Muslim friend, to take you seriously that it's been corrupted. Can you please show me the before and after so I can see the corruption? Because that would cement the deal that, why should I take this earlier stuff, seriously if in fact it hasn't been? Where's the change? And if you want to talk to somebody seriously about, 1 John 5:8 or the end of Mark or something like that. But Muslims don't know those arguments. That's higher criticism arguments that have been going on for a while, and we have responses. And Christians have all sorts of responses on these things. They're more serious, but most Muslims don't do that kind of thing. Muslim apologists might quote, today they love Bart Ehrman or people like that. And there's ways around that argument as well. But most Muslims don't. And I don't have arguments with things that they don't even begin to understand or are not interested in. So I want to focus on the fact that If it's corrupted, I need to see that it's corrupted. I take this seriously. You might also ask Muslims for something like this. I already mentioned the Abraham one, but you might want to ask them, because it's very common for a Muslim to say, Jesus could not be Allah incarnate. Jesus can't be God incarnate. No, not even possible. God is the creator of the entire universe. He filled the universe, all this kind of language. So you might ask, okay, let me run with that for a minute. So if I believe that God is all powerful, he is so incredibly all powerful. I'm really buying into it, guys. He's all powerful. But he can't do something as simple as incarnate in the human flesh. I thought he was all powerful. So is he somewhat powerful? Is he kind of powerful up to a certain wall here where he can't go past that? If you're going to tell me he's all powerful, please help me understand how he can't do this. And in fact, it's not just the incarnation of Jesus, but you can go to Genesis 18 and all sorts of other places, and you can do this with Orthodox Jews as well, and point out how God seems to incarnate several times in all sorts of different ways, whether it's a theophany or Christophany or those kind of Christian distinctions. It's all over the place, but Allah seems to be incapable of doing such a thing. I'm sorry, I was confused. I thought what I heard you say was all powerful, and now I'm hearing you say that he's not. He can't protect his own word. He can't incarnate. It seems like Allah is very limited in important ways in his claims of being all powerful. Again, there's so much more stuff. I have here the corruption of the text, which is kind of what we're talking about. But Jay Smith and all sorts of guys are pointing out, and there's all sorts of what would be 150 years ago in the Christian world, higher critical attempts to take apart the Qur'an and the Hadith and point out all sorts of fun things. Now, I don't talk to Muslims about this yet. I might incorporate this later, but because it's relatively new as far as how this is going, but there's seemingly no evidence that Mecca was any place important. There's no evidence that most of what the Quran talks about is written in southern Arabia. It seems to be written up in the Syria area. All the references that are pointed out and stuff like that. All right, I'm not even getting into that with them yet. And the average Muslim, doesn't know anything about it and probably will reject it as a Christian lie. But the argument that Jay, who's more familiar with talking to Muslims than all of us put together, probably, the argument that Jay's pointing out is that this points to an undermining of their own understanding of their own text. And again, you could argue that if in fact you could show that the Bible was made up 500 years ago, I'm just going to pull out something silly like this. You could say this, which because not a lot of people believe things like that. Or the Roman Catholic priests, because they hate women, made up these rules 400 years after Jesus. There were no eyewitnesses, on and on. You hear these claims all over the place. Well, if that was actually the case, wow, that would be a powerful argument. Except it's not the case. There's so many arguments against these kinds of claims. Well, Islam is struggling, and that's what Jay's pointing out, and David Wood and others, that they're struggling with the fact that they don't really have very good answers when their own sources themselves point back to these kinds of problems in the Quranic text and everything else. Again, I don't get lost in that kind of stuff. I want to talk about the sacrifice a lot. I want to talk about having Jesus as your covering a lot, because that's something that they relate to powerfully. It's something that grabs them. And again, I think there's all sorts of wonderful responses to all these claims they make, and I've given you just a handful of those. But simply put, don't be afraid to raise your voice. They don't shy away from that. That's okay. I mean, judge the situation, take the temperature in the room, I always say. See whether they're up for this or not. As you raise your voice, you see them getting really mad, well, then back off. That's what happened with that Satanist Mo 2 years ago.
You need to go into wrap-up mode here, Bill.
Oh, okay. Well, wrap-up mode. Don't be afraid to raise your voice. Do not be afraid to show your faith publicly. When you talk about corruption of the text, I forgot this one part. A common ending to that, once you said it's been corrupted, who has done this? Let's kill him. Every Muslim understands that language. Who is this man that corrupted the text? What an evil person this must be. Share your emotions on this. Muslims appreciate that altogether. And I would say that the primary emotion, of course, is to love them like nobody's business. No matter what they've done, no matter what they uphold, that we cross the line that Jesus tells us to cross. The hardest thing he tells us to do is to love those who persecute, love those who bless those who have persecuted you. And that's the answer. The love of Christ in action here is the the best, to quote Francis Schaeffer, is the final apologetic. It's the best apologetic of all.
Yeah.
And it has no equivalent. Yes, Allah is a God of love. There's one of 99 names. And there's no illustrations in the Quran or Hadith, but the Bible's full of illustrations of God's love for his enemies, of God's love for the people who have opposed him. I'm living testimony, many of you are as well, of God's love for people who hated him, who were very opposed. So that's sort of my wrap up, John. There's all these different links I have down there for a lot more serious discussion about all these things. Again, I mentioned Jay, I mentioned David Wood, Robert Spencer is an excellent resource.
Oh, yeah.
Either. You're known by your enemies, I guess in this case. These are all very good sources, and I highly recommend. And again, I would say, just for the podcast's sake, if you have questions, you can, if they're bad questions, ask Don. If they're reasonable questions, you can send them along to me.
There you go.
Is that good summing up, Don?
That sounds like it. And then next week, we have Don Williams up to center stage, chapter 7 of his book.
Up to that.
Yep.
Way past
95
chapter 7,
Thesis for a New Reformation. Yep, that's coming up. And so chapter 17, 5 Theses on Renaissance.
Are you
Okay.
talking about the fair with
next
lots
week.
of snakes and stuff?
You know that
All right.
the textual corruption argument really backfires in ways that I run into few people who understand. If you got two traditions, tradition A has all kinds of ancient documents going back almost to the 1st century, where the original was, and they say, hey, we're putting this stuff online where everybody can come and see it. Check it out. Here's group B. They take one copy of their document, they burn everything else that would be evidence that it hadn't been corrupted, and they say, okay, this is the pure thing, and this is the one we're going with. Now, if I'm looking at this from the outside, which one of these two groups do I suspect of having a corrupted text? Because one of them looks like they're trying to hide that really, really hard. And the other group is saying, hey, here's the textual tradition. We've preserved it. It's all there. Anybody wants to can come and look at it. We're going to put it online for you.
Yep.
Which one of these two groups do I want to trust?
Yeah. There's
There's
examples.
only one.
3 complete codexes of the New Testament, compilations of the New Testament prior to the time of Muhammad. And it's virtually word for word with what we have right now.
Yep.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, the copy of Isaiah, literally like, the stuff we have now. There's just so much, along Don's point there, there's so much evidence for the one and the other get corrupted. I found it also interesting, Don. There's a woman who's put together this amazing list of like 26 different versions of the Quran, all of which are different.
Oh,
that stand right now.
Wow.
Well, they didn't burn them all, did they?
Apparently not.
Some people were making up other stuff later on because
you could always make it up along the way.
Yeah.
Wowza.
All right. Well, we're going to end the stream. That doesn't mean we're going to stop yapping over here, but we're going to end the stream online. So adios, everybody out there. See you next week with Don Williams.
Sayonara.